Right, so moving on to evacuation procedure. We've got Matt here as visitor tonight, so we haven't got anything planned to evacuate. So if you hear the alarm, please do evacuate to the nearest safe exit, which is behind you. So all visitors need to report to assembly point G, and all staff report to their designated assembly point on Woolpack car park. And just don't leave the assembly point for any reason until told to do so by the incident controller, which tonight will probably be full. So we'll all follow you. Thank you. Hopefully we won't need that. Apologies for absence. So we have Councillor Clues, as substituted by Councillor Bell. We have Councillor Martin Watson, substituted by Councillor Jarvis. We have Councillor Humphreys, apologies, substituted by Councillor Jens. And we have apologies from Councillor Singh and Councillor Parsons, who is substituted by Councillor Wiley. Is that everything? Right, thank you. So welcome to people who don't normally come to resources. We like new people. Okay, any disclosure of pecuniary or non-pecuniary interests? Is there anything? I think so. And public participation, we haven't been issued with any questions. So then moving on to agenda item 5, which is the minutes of our resources board that we held on the 20th of October. The minutes here for signing. So the first page, if anyone's got any questions or any points or comments on those. Second page. Okay, I'll sign those if I have a proposer. So thank you, Byron, Councillor Amelia for proposing, Councillor Gilmore for seconding. All in favour? Thank you. Done before. Lovely. So we'll move on.
Yeah, sorry, I've just been mentioned before. Did you just want to mention that the internal audit working plan met?
Yes, I was going to say, where do we want to put that? We can do that. So just interjecting into that agenda item there, 5A. We had the last month meeting, we had the internal audit working party that we agreed we would do, and we talked about that in the minutes. That was item 15, and that the before the next meeting that we would do that. And we met last Wednesday for the first time and put together in terms of reference. That was Councillor Gilmont, Councillor Watson, Paul from the officer group, and Martin from CMAP, and myself, and Councillor Barnett. So, but again, it was open, and there was a good representation across the party. I think we all come up with sort of what we want to do, what were the purposes, and we've agreed we'll meet early in January and invite officers who have got quite a few outstanding internal audits to come and speak to us at that next meeting. So that was one of the actions coming out of that. There were serious actions, but in terms of reference, which we can circulate on email to everybody and follow that on. Is there any questions on that? Oh, great. Do you want to make a comment on that at all, Paul?
No, it's fine.
Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 6 then, on the funding settlements in relation to the waste. This we have a report in front of us here. Our purpose and the need tonight is to note the assessment issued by the Council of PAC UK 26-27, and our commitment to improving the refuse and recycling service, and also to note the work being undertaken by Simply Recycling and the working group in reviewing and suggesting improvements to our service. Do you want to comment at all on the report before we open up for questions, Mike?
Just to set the scene, in 25-26, this financial year, the council received £732,481 as part of the government's extended producers' responsibility scheme. That funding is to enable the council to be able to recover from its domestic waste stream packaging material. And while doing so, demonstrate that the service is operated effectively and efficiently. Now, it must reach those standards, which will be set by PAC UK now, and the council will be audited to ensure it is operating effectively and efficiently. We got notification early last month that for 2026-27, the council will receive a further £749,381, which is great news, but we've got to improve our services to be able to ensure we continue to receive that funding going forward. Now, when we talk about packaging, it's not just the domestic, what's in your bin. It will become 2028 what's in the litter bins on the street. So we need to think about how we wisely invest that money to improve and recover that packaging material. Via the C&E board, we established a Simple Recycling member working group who will be looking at the current services, what's in the bin, and how best we improve the services to demonstrate we're effective and efficient going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Are there any questions in relation to this report? Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm encouraged that the C&E board is going to be looking to see what's in the bin. Could you just confirm for me, is the figure one at paragraph 4.2 based upon North Warwickshire data, or is that been out for the whole of the UK?
.2. So the
It's on.
yeah,
It's on.
30% of mixed recycling and to extract 40% of food waste.
Okay.
Mike, do you want to take that one?
Set out in the report, as you'll see on the following page, you will see that within our own domestic refuse bins, 40% of that is food waste. That's our current makeup, what's in our bin. In addition to that, you'll also see that mixed recycling still counts for 31% of the material that's still in that domestic bin and not moved over to the recycling bin. So the figures that you have on 4.2 are what the council's current position is in relation to its domestic bin, but its household waste, not its recycling bin.
Sorry, Chairman, I just want confirmation that was North Warwickshire data.
It is.
Yeah.
No, it is.
And did we undertake a study to establish that in 2022?
Yes.
Thank you, Chairman.
So on what frequency then, following on from that, on what frequency do those studies happen? Is that the most up-to-date data? Have we improved at all since then?
We don't have any further data that's being provided in relation to that. However, because we're introducing food waste collections as part of our statutory responsibility from the 31st of March, we are proposing that after 6 months, we revisit the data and we assess what's in the bin to see what impact those food waste collections and education has had. You'll hear about a paper later on, talks about additional resources to drive that change that's needed to ensure we demonstrate we're effective and efficient.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on that? No. Councillor Riley.
How much resource does it take to undergo a study? I'm just thinking it would be quite nice to have an up-to-date baseline.
We thought so. However, with having to introduce food waste in March, it felt that it would be easier to introduce that change to the service and then re-measure based on different demographics across the whole borough. To do that, it's around about £20,000. And it meant that we'd be spending 20 now and 20 again next year. But we already know we have to do this change anyway. So officers said it would be easier to push it back. That was discussed at the member working group, and they're looking for the data within 6 months that has completed the change to actually start collecting food waste. We still don't know how much food waste we're going to extract from this service, nor do we know yet how we will deal effectively in removing and changing that packaging and other waste from the communal bin sites, those which service flats where multiple people use. So it's important that we put in the changes and then we do the monitoring and then we target that education to those locations to help that change take place.
Perfect.
Thank you. Councillor Bell.
Yeah, can I just confirm that the food waste that's in this diagram includes packaged food that's never been opened? So I've got a concern going forward that that won't change. People will, if they've got food that's out of date, I'm not sure that many people will open those packages, put the food in the food waste and the rest in the bin. So it'd be interesting to see what happens there.
So the shocking statistic is that 16% of that food waste is still in its packaging.
Yeah.
And it's important that we're able to target those areas where that's occurring. But until we've started to gather the information, done the assessments, then we won't be able to target that education in the right place. But 16% is currently still in its packaging. But it is coming from certain demographics, which we're happy to share information with separately if it helps.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Joe. Given that both of the items in the recommendation are simply for noting, what I'm curious about is what is the downside if we don't change that?
Two things happen. First of all, we are a statutory waste collection authority, and therefore we have a duty to comply with the legislation as it's set. So we must introduce food waste. If not, we choose not to do that, government would just intervene and do that by issuing an instruction to either another organisation to do it for us or to actually step in and run those services. Now, I don't believe that's the position where the council want to go to. So to help the communities recycle, recover and do the right things based not on what legislation said, but the right things to the environment, we're proposing to introduce food waste collections.
Nice answer, but it didn't answer the question, did it?
Were you saying, because the report's for noting, if we did nothing, what difference would it make?
It's partially that, and partially the point on that Margaret raised, that 16% is unopened food, and it's going to be quite a challenge to do that. So what is the sliding scale? I can understand the point about why we should try and do it. My question was, if it doesn't work, what is the downside?
Yeah, and also a reduction in funding, but I'll let Mike tell you about that.
Yeah, there's two elements to this. First of all, what is food waste over here? And we have a statutory obligation which to introduce and with the food waste. We can't mix that up with packaging and this funding, because this funding is for packaging waste, and therefore the recovery of that packaging waste from the waste stream. So we then, if you wish, industry who are producing packaging is paying us to collect and sort of material. If we didn't drive forward those changes, we would not demonstrate we're effective or efficient, and we run a risk of losing a large proportion of that funding each year. And that funding, as you will see from the paper later on, will be supporting resources within this organisation to help drive that change and support the communities.
So ultimately, if we didn't do that, we could end up with a liability.
Two risks. One, a step in from government by doing your services for you as you fail to deliver your statutory obligation. And two, to lose a significant amount of funding that the council's currently receiving.
Thank you.
I'm not against doing any of this, but yeah, honestly, those risks are pretty distant, aren't they? You know, the authority's got 2.5 years to live.
And well, I think the two things come hand in hand, don't they? Because there's an expectation on producers, on manufacturers, because that's where this money comes from. This money comes from the manufacturers who are using packaging material that can't be recycled still, where they still can't, there's elements of it that can't be recycled and elements that can. And obviously to encourage them. So as a manufacturer, you get a levy for the tonnage you produce that has to then be dealt with. The other end it goes into a waste stream.
I get that, Jan, but yeah, we all know we're one of the smallest authorities in the UK. So the contribution they're making to us in the scheme of things across the UK, we're going to be getting one of the lower amounts of cash. So presumably, to ensure they're acting efficiently and effectively, they'll be looking at the larger authorities with the larger amounts of subsidies first. We know that our data was 2022. We might get some in 26. They then have to compare that to the results in 27 and we no longer exist on 28.
Yeah, and I suppose the risk to us as an authority is quite small that they're going to step in and take on and do it for us, because obviously that takes resource in itself, doesn't it? But actually, we've committed through different streams, through different boards, that this is something we're going to do, because obviously it ties in with one of our other things that's a statutory duty. So I think, we're here to note the report, but yes, these are good questions to challenge us on and make sure that we're doing the right things. Mike, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, through you, Chair. The position with this is the council will be audited next financial year. So in 26-27, from its funding contribution for 27-28. As set out within this document of a letter from government or from PAC UK, it does set out what that percentage hit could be. And that can be anything from 20% upwards for you failing to demonstrate that you're operating or working towards operating effectively and efficiently. It doesn't want you to get there overnight. It wants to see that journey you're going on when we speak to the department. So to me, when we've looked at our packaging as key, we then need to look at our street cleaning facilities and how we separate that material and what infrastructure we're putting on our streets. Because in the end, this is not just for us, this is for the benefits of our communities and our residents as a whole.
Thank you. Are there any more questions on that one? No, if not, I'm happy to move that from the chair. Do I have a second? Councillor Gilmont, all in favour of noting these two parts of our report tonight, A and B? Thank you. That's carried. And then agenda item 7, which is our risk management report. So I'd like to welcome Matt Humphrey to our board this evening. Our recommendation tonight is that the strategic management summary report and the emerging risk radar are noted, and that the strategic risk register and strategic risk matrix are endorsed by this board. So, Paul, do you want to give a bit of an intro to the report there?
Yeah, thank you, through the chair. So this is the second iteration of the work that we've started on risk in the last 6 to 8 months. It's a refresh of the risk register. So we've taken the risk register, each individual area, looked at it through management team and worked with Matt and Matt's team to develop that further. That's something that we'll do at least twice a year. We'll try and do it more, but at the minute it looks like we'll be doing that twice a year to make sure that that's up to date and as effective as it possibly can be. So I'll hand over to Matt. I'll introduce the report and talk us through some of those changes.
Thanks, Paul. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah, fine. Fabulous. Okay, yeah. Last report was July 2025, where we introduced the strategic risk register. If you remember, we also talked about the strategic risk framework that we're introducing to the council. We're focusing largely on strategic risk. So these are the items, the big ticket items that matter to the council and the achievement of their priorities. Looking to understand where we carry some exposure with regards to things that might go wrong, as well as it says progressing and exploiting opportunity. So at the moment, you've got an overview report, which I produce, which includes commentary with regards to movements and shifts and reasons why they occurred between the two reports, July 2025 and this report. And you've also got a risk register, which gives quite a lot of granular detail around the risks themselves, why they're risks, the control environment and actions that are being taken, and also identifies whether or not they're within or outside risk appetite. Risk appetite is something we're exploring a bit further with the management team to understand how they can use that better as part of their decision making and influencing how much they do with regards to risk. Just so you understand that, and bear in mind, back in July 2025, we've come quite a long way because before that we introduced this and there wasn't anything. So just bear in mind, it's always there's a continual iteration, a continual step forward, one step at a time. So just bear that in mind as well. So largely what we've got here is the picture of the strategic risk. We've also produced a heat map, which shows the scoring of those risks, position of the risks on the matrix, considering the probability or likelihood. So you can get a full understanding of the picture of those strategic risks that the council are seeking to manage. And in addition to that, apart from facilitating the conversations that we have done with management to understand where they are with regards to management of these strategic risks, we've also undertaken a comparison with the emerging risk radar that RSM produce every 6 months. This is our sort of 6th publication, and largely what we do is we draw together information that we've obtained through boards that we work with and the views that board members have. So this is boards across all different sectors in order to pick up this radar and present a set of risks that are emerging risks that are on people's minds. And we've drawn a comparison between the strategic risk register and emerging risks as well. Why did we do that? Well, one, we wanted to make sure that the risk register that you've got largely addressed those, and if they didn't, just to consider whether they are items that are still on the mind of maybe management, even though they're not presenting themselves as a risk at this point in time. So now we've ended up with a fully fleshed out, shall I say, strategic risk register, which I've described. And we've also got this emerging risk radar profile, which we'll keep going back to. And as RSM continue to update that, and the next publication will probably be March, we'll be doing a comparison with that as well. If you remember last time, in the strategic risk register, there was also a controls effectiveness assessment, which was largely a self-assessment by management over whether the controls worked as they should or shouldn't. And there was quite a big debate around that, if you remember rightly, because internal audit had often raised quite a lot of issues. And management was saying one thing and internal audit another. But again, that's about maturity and looking at the control environment, understanding whether they work or not. And management are getting, dare I say, better at that. And I don't think management might be saying that. And understanding the controls they've got and how well they work. We'll be undertaking that exercise again in January, there or thereabouts, reporting back to this committee during probably February or March, whenever the next meeting is after then. So you've got to then, probably what that will lead to is further actions being taken in improving the way in which you manage risk within the council. There's 3 what I call high risks that have been scored as high risk at the moment. One of those relates to health, safety and wellbeing. And that's largely due to the fact that we've got limited capacity with regards to audits that should be done with regards to health and safety. And so there's an increased level of exposure there. We may not find something that exists. So hence it's been increased, but there's actions being taken to address that. The other is in connection with continuity of services and resilience. Of course, we continually, if you look at the strategic risk in totality, there's a low level of necessary capacity at the moment in the council, but we've also got heightened threat from cyber attacks. So hence that's gone up a little bit, and we're recognising that's a threat to the council at this moment in time, and further actions being taken. I will say something here, which is what's been really interesting having the chats with management is from the first time we did this, the first iterations now, management are tuning into this is something we need to deal with. We need to take some steps and address this. So we're providing updates on the actions, obviously through to this committee. And the other item, of course, is the LGR, where we obviously face quite a significant change in the way in which the council will exist, and indeed democracy will be fulfilled, I guess, if I can put it in that way. And that presents another risk, in particular around preparedness, because I think as a council, we've got to look at a couple of different aspects here. One, preparing ourselves for the fact that LGR will happen. I don't need to talk out of turn here, but potentially it may not happen. There's so much going on in this environment that invariably we need to be ready for that. So LGR as a preparedness risk also becomes slightly problematic for us. I'll end by saying, so I'm sure most people would like to ask lots and lots of questions, and I'm always happy to answer as much as I can. If you look at the strategic risks, by impact, they are all high because they will be seriously material to the council were they to come to fruition. Hence, you get a high impact. But the idea is through the controls, we reduce the likelihood. So you're never going to get rid of the impact, but ideally, you're going to try and shift those risks across to the left-hand side of the matrix at the top. So that's all I'm going to say. So I think I've given you enough of a warm up and a tee up for you to ask me lots of questions. So I'm going to stop there and open up to yourselves.
Before we kick off with questions, can I just ask one thing? In terms of, I quite like in the emerging risks, you've got the wheel, which sections them into societal and community governance, economic, etc. In the actual risk register, whilst they've got the code, when you're reading that across, it's not always clear. You have to read a lot of the detail. It'd be quite good to have them in sections, just as a little bit of a guide for helping us to understand and read them and digest them a little bit better. So we can almost apportion ownership, because one of the other things that you can't see in this table is who owns that risk.
Yeah, so in the strategic risk register itself, you can, as I said, there's a lot of detail in there. And interestingly, we have now a lot of organisations, not just local authorities, that say to us, could we present the strategic risks in the form of a radar, so you get a much more holistic view of those types of risk and where they sit with regards to impact and likelihood? And yes, we can. So we could take that away, Caroline, and look at the way in which we present that in the future, so that you can more easily absorb it and have a conversation around all of those risks. That doesn't mean we won't keep the risk register, because that's always necessary from a just having the level of detail you require. But maybe for this committee, we can look at having a radar presentation as well.
Thank you. Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mine's just an observation with the first part, with the health and safety. I would imagine that includes the compliance side of things for the council. Obviously, that's a massive thing for the council, a big undertaking. There's a lot of legislation that's changing the government at the moment regarding housing qualifications and the assessments, the independent assessments that are happening around housing, and the qualifications that officers are going to need to be able to carry out all that updated legislation. So I presume we've got sight of that risk in the first section that you said about health and safety, and that'll be included in there somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne, for the question. Yeah, obviously health and safety is really key, and one of the things that we've highlighted through the internal control mechanisms through internal audit is that some of the internal audits are outstanding. So one of the things that's really difficult is assessing that risk in relation to mitigating against what we're doing, because we want to understand the control environment a lot more. And that's why we're putting the pressure on through the working party to ensure that we get those internal audit responses, so that we can understand where that really sits and what our exposure is. And what Matt alluded to there was about our exposure is higher at the moment, because we're not certain of that, because those audits are outstanding, and that's how it all becomes quite cyclical. So I'll let you come back on that, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just absolutely right. We are having a change of personnel within health and safety. And bringing more resource into that area. So the change of personnel will actually be a positive. Somebody who's been on long-term sick. And they're leaving, so we're also bringing some additional resource to help kind of support in that area. So that will be a positive from the housing compliance perspective. That's mostly dealt with within the housing team. And I mean, Andrew and I had a conversation about this last week in terms of resources and moving capital resources around to be able to deal with just those sorts of things like mould, particularly, which is obviously very high profile at the moment. So absolutely, from the housing perspective, all over that, from the corporate side, and getting that oversight and understanding the additional resources will really help.
Councillor Barnett, Councillor Simpson.
You've already alluded to the issues we're having with the internal audit and getting the actions there followed up. So we've got quite a few actions listed on here. So do we have named individuals for all of those, and do we have a kind of director level person who's got line of sight of it to make sure they get followed up? And is there anything we can do to make sure that they do get followed up in those timescales that are indicated?
I completely agree with you, which is why one of the columns I'd like to see in this report is owner. And so who owns that risk? I know collectively we all own that risk as a council, but from the management team, who is driving the mitigation? Who is accountable for delivering the actions to mitigate the inherent risk in the to the remaining risks once we've done those pieces of work. Because if we do nothing, if nobody's owning it, we do nothing, everything's sitting over here in the left column. And we're not getting anywhere near the further right column.
Can I just add, Councillor Simmons, not Caroline, sorry, earlier on, a bit too informal, obviously, that's it. Just on the risk register itself, you've got a risk owner, which you've identified just below the description. So that is the individual who's responsible for
Am I being
risk.
really blind? Is it too small?
Yeah, it might be, it's quite small, yeah, I've got my screen on large, so that's okay.
Yeah.
So you can see a risk owner, which is going to be one of the management team as it currently stands, or senior management within the council, okay? But they are going to be wholly responsible for ensuring that the controls and the actions are progressed.
Yeah.
They can't necessarily devolve that responsibility and accountability. So we have got a named owner, and when we facilitate our conversations with council management, we push them pretty hard with regards to where they're at and what action is being taken. And one of the things that actually is a big failing in risk management is where you've got actions, then the data slips. So as far as possible, we will be holding management to account around that. So we have got a named risk owner. And then if it leads to a point where we need to be much clearer about who's taking up the individual actions and identifying the officer responsible for that, even though the risk responsibility lays with the owner, then we can include that if necessary.
Okay.
Yeah, apologies. I was looking in the actions column. I've missed that they got an order under the risk.
Yes, me too.
For an extra level of accountability, there's no reason why we can't be clear about who the officer might be that's taking that action if that was appropriate.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. But the other part of that is actually, so, this is health and safety. This is falling under the HR manager. Actually, there's operational accountability that probably doesn't sit with her. So actually, it's making sure the operational accountability is with the right person. And you can be reporting, maybe the reporting statistics and KPIs fall upon her, but actually, does the delivery of our health and safety agenda fall to our HR manager? Probably not.
Yeah,
So that's about appropriateness, really.
I was just going to say, accountability for health and safety. If you think about these strategic risks, although we have individual risk owners, we deal with them on an individual basis, but then we come back at intervals with the management team, and it's incumbent on the management team with regards to strategic risks to ensure they're managed. So it's never a situation where we just talk to one individual. It's a bit like talking to Paul just about finance and then ignoring everybody else in the council who's got a budget. Paul may be the Section 151 officer and be responsible for medium-term financial planning, its delivery, but invariably there's a lot of facets that go into that, and we have to ensure that each one of the management team are accountable in their way for finance, health and safety, cyber. So hence we bring them back together to have that sort of round table conversation. So hopefully that does reinforce some of the messaging. However, there will be instances where we need to have somebody who's very much specifically responsible, and health and safety is a great example where this is being driven, and at the moment there is an element of low capacity there, as Paul's alluded to. So yeah.
Thank you. I have Councillor Simpson and Councillor Barnett, I think. Is that right?
Thanks, Chairman. I completely agree with Councillor Barnett's comment. We've seen an initial failure to attend to internal audit's recommendations. Not sure how more successful now with the risk management review, particularly when every target is said to be variable. I'd like to see a little bit more specificity, please. Because otherwise, if it's variable, it's variable. What does it mean? Normally, when I look at the heat map, I'd expect to see a net and gross risk. How will the risk change if all of the action points and the control details are implemented? So what I'd like to understand from this is, how will these risks change if the control detail and the risk improvements that we're looking for, how will they move the dial? Because if they're not going to move the dial, well, we can't measure that. We've got a big question over the effectiveness of what we're trying to achieve. I think some of the action details are a little bit hopeful. I think there's one where it's talking about not effectively responding to regulatory change. And the action detail is basically introduced Power BI. I think there's a bit more to it than a new IT system. So some of these, I'm just not entirely convinced about the rigour that's been through in here. How have we identified it? What is the financial and other consequence of failure? And what will it look like when we got it into a better place? I'm not sure the report as it is telling you. No, I absolutely accept, Chairman, that this is, you know, significantly better than where we were. But I would like to see an effective measure of the risk and a measure of the improvement that we are seeking. And some of that implies putting a pound sign on it rather than just words. And we haven't got any pound signs on any of this. I'd like to understand, how does this compare to other authorities? Particularly because when I read the emerging risk register, I didn't get any specificity to North Warwickshire. I thought that felt to me like it was almost anybody. So is that us or is that generic? And how are we going to measure our the improvement over time? How will I know in 6 months' time that we've moved the dial? And can we have a net and gross assessment?
Thank you. Yeah, I think success criteria is really important, isn't it? When you're setting something out, saying we acknowledge we're here, we want to be there. How do we know we've got there, or at least made progress? And I think that's one of the things that we all want to see in terms of performance indicators, performance metrics across the board. And I think we're in a bit of a loop in relation to that. Power BI keeps being mentioned, but actually I think there's a real gap in terms of where we are and what we want to be. I think us understanding what that success criteria looks like is really key to that, as well as being able to see that net and gross assessment. Some of the things are probably easier to put pounds on than others. An assessment, you know, some things are a bit more intangible, but where we can, I think it's probably sensible to say, you know, what that could cost us. We've heard tonight, if we don't do something, we could lose funding. That's a risk to this authority. If we don't do something, how much could we lose? You know, could we lose half of it? Could we lose a third of it? What would that mean to us? What exposure does that give us? That's a way of us evaluating that a little bit. But Paul, you look like you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I'm sure Mel want to come in too. So I just want to say, yeah, I completely agree. And we are moving forward that. So currently what's in the register or the summarisation of the register is the inherent and the residual risk from the mitigations that we've got in place. And there is a target that will work up with RSM, but the initial kind of iteration of the register was about us understanding what mitigations we got in place, because a lot of the mitigations that we went through back in July, when I went through and looked at the ones that I'm responsible for, weren't mitigations that were in place. So there's almost a 3-stage. So the inherent risk, the residual risk from the mitigations that are in place, but also then the mitigations that we're working to on the action plan, where they take us to. And that's what that target column is for, but hasn't been populated yet, and that's what we're going to work up next. So it's a really good point. And the emerging, sorry, I was just going to say on your question on the emerging risk radar, and again, Matt, I'm sure will want to comment on this. So it's a helicopter view of things that could impact on North Warwickshire. Yes, they will impact on, or could and would look like they will impact on lots of other people, but often they're high-level things, political and legislative, which would impact on lots of different authorities, but they are specific to these could impact on North Warwickshire.
And that's helpful, Karen. I mean, I think what I'm looking for is, you know, failure to manage this risk effectively will cost 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, whatever it is. And in some of these risks that are in here, I can hazard a guess at what they are. I mean, the leisure project, for example, not getting that right. I think we all have a view, given that we're spending, I think £25 million on that. So what failing? No, 25. I was assured consistently 25. That's what I was told, Margaret. 25.
Well, you're talking about just the construction, or you're talking about the whole?
There you go.
Yeah,
The slippery sands of local government. Good
Sounds
talk,
like a
Chairman.
risk to me.
Chairman, it's getting worse than trying to understand what the OER says, isn't it? So what I'd like to understand is what is it? Because there are things in here where I can, without a lot of knowledge, try and put a risk onto it or value to it. And if I sort of think through the planning, for example, we have some strategic, financially important risks which are not in here. They may not hit some of the dizzy heights that some of these risks do, but financially, for example, the impact of a significant number of appeals certainly gets us into there. Now, that's sort of referenced in the failure to have a local plan. But what I do think is that each board should be tasked to look at this and say within that board's remit, what the members feel the strategic risks are. Because I think, you know, everyone has a different view on what they are. And I think it's important that we approach this holistically, and the council as a body thinks about what the risks are that affect each board. And I think each political group has input into that as well, because there isn't just one answer to it. But I do think it's important that we do a bit more groupthink to try and understand where we also as members feel the strategic risks of.
I think there's value in that. I think one of the things that is, we have highlighted when we talked about it with the internal auditor, not everything that comes to a risk register will be, you know, is something that they would do an audit on, because actually there's a lot of risk in some of the other activities that we do. So, for example, what you've highlighted there is actually budgetary control. You know, if we don't get that right and we have a lot of appeals, then there's huge slippage financially, there's financial risk, and there's an inherent risk there. So it sits within sort of different areas, if you like, not necessarily highlighted and brought out as a strategic risk, but having a gap or any kind of black hole is obviously very controversial and difficult to manage. So we do need to look at that, and particularly around the local plan, particularly around being pushed to do that because of other changes, and political change has caused us to have the lack of funding for the A5, the change in that, so that's local plan at risk, and So those are emerging risks that cause us to have to do other things. So I do think they should probably be better reflected in our risk register. So perhaps we should do that and set each board an opportunity to just have a look at things that are relevant to them and maybe feed into that process. But that is done through, we've got Mike, we've got Nick, and we have Paul. And that's part of their remit, is to determine and to bring to us what those strategic risks are through those board reports as well.
And one final point, I'm not really sure I'm getting the difference between risk 13 and risk 14. 13 is local government reorganisation, 14 is devolution. Particularly given that I'm not sure there is an opportunity for this authority. I accept societally there is a strategic risk.
It's not a risk for us, it's not for us at the moment to take the opportunities of devolution. I suppose that's a future, that's much more in the future, isn't it? Whether or not there's some alignment that can happen in advance to ensure that through LGR. Paul, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a fair point. I think those two could quite easily be combined. I think to the other point, to the example you gave, I think is an operational cost of a strategic risk. So is it an operational risk in terms of planning? Because I take the point that if the plan's not delivered, then it could result in additional costs through appeals, etc. But those would be usually managed within the operational risk register, not within the strategic risk register. So that's why they're not in the strategic risk, and why the costs are not set out in the strategic risk, because they're essentially operational risk, or in my mind they're operational risk because they're managed through budget monitoring and the budget monitoring process, which is operational. So, but this is very much, and I've used the term not 5 minutes ago. This is the helicopter view. This is the strategic view that we're trying to look at. We need to make sure that those operational risk registers for his service plans are in place as well. And I suspect if we dug that some of them are there and some of them are okay and some of them aren't. And this process needs to feed right way down to the organisation. Some of those things will bubble up to be strategic risks from operation that they can and do. And how we get that right and how we see that over time is how we will judge the risk register, and both operational and strategic, so that we do have oversight of those things. And that's why the emerging risk radar is important, because those things we can see coming because they're affected and changed by things that are outside of our control, whether it's changes in legislation, whether it's political changes. LGR is a classic example. We're all sitting in here, and I suspect every single one of us have a different view as to whether we think it will happen or not happen, or what might happen. Will some go? Will others not go? And it's the biggest thing that's facing us. Bigger than the 27 or 25, depending on your view, how legislative.
Sorry, I remember one sarcastic comment. I was warned, it's heartwarming to see that in here there was a risk that we might end up with a qualified audit opinion. I would see that at the minute as a positive.
And having an audit opinion, yes, that would be actually a step forward, wouldn't it? To actually have an audit opinion. Councillor Osborne wanted to come in. Sorry, thank you for your patience there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's a good discussion we've had so far tonight to recognise that, like Mark says, with the financial risks, and some are external financial risks and some are internal. And the risks themselves, some will materialise and some won't. It's very much like dominoes from inside that can affect outside and outside inside. So you've got all of those different factors, but one of the ones that we have to do are the statutory risks, the compliance, where ombudsmen can get involved and tell us that we've not complied, something like, I don't know, Legionella, we've got a statutory duty to check for our properties for Legionella. Those are the risks where we can plan and we can see the differences, like Mark said, where we can see that improvement plan is working. We've put this and this in place and we've gone from here to here. So I think where we can, it'd be great to have an emphasis on the compliance to note that we were in this position, we're now in this one, and by month, whatever, we intend to be in this one. So you can see that the improvement plan is improving things, and otherwise, as I say, ombudsmen will come in and start to do it for us, or we'll be left with the choice of self-referring, and then they'll put us on their improvement plan. Thank you.
Questions on that, or any other points anyone would like to make? We'll come back to Matt.
Yeah, thank you. All the observations that have been made and comments are really useful, to be honest. And I think this is the sort of debate I would always expect at a resources committee or an audit and risk committee that I might be attending. So that's a positive thing. Just remember also that, of course, we've made reference, of course, Councillor Simpson, to the financial, exposure you might be carrying, but bear in mind also there are reputation damage and stuff like that can also play through, so it becomes equally important as well. So let's take the leisure sector as an example without talking about it, but there you go. And also the regulatory items that Councillor Osborne has been referring to as well. So let's just bear that in mind, that there is not just a financial measure, there are other implications that can come through. The points taken, I think as we go through the next iteration, then invariably we'll try to put a little bit more explicitness around the exposure that's being carried, and I think that's worth doing. I've noted the points around having some clearer outcomes with regards to when the risk has been effectively managed and what that might mean. Obviously, we have got the gross and net, as you refer to, we call inherent residual in the report, but as Paul said, we can introduce target as well. And we would want to see, through the actions that are being taken, a movement across to the left-hand side of that matrix. Your point taken regards the Power BI. I think there's a mixture of items are in there. It doesn't feel very strategic as an action, but it feels like it might lead into perhaps some better performance information being used within the council and therefore help decision making. So you do get a mixture of actions that get captured, and as we refine this process, that would improve as well, I think. And yeah, I just endorse your movement that you're taking with regards to internal audit actions. That's quite important to your management of risk. Otherwise, as we talk more with the internal auditors and with management, these risks might start to, as Paul says, become bigger risks rather than lesser risks as we start to understand more and stuff bubbles up from the bottom to the surface, which we hope doesn't occur. But that's what risk management is about. It's a moving feast, and we use it as a bit of a barometer as it currently is and looking forward as well. So having the conversation around tonight, I think it's a good thing to have, to be honest. So that's my end.
Cool.
And just very briefly to finish, so one of the things that I would like to do and hopefully get your approval of is for Matt and risk management to be on the agenda. I mean, if we have 5 meetings a year, Matt should be here for at least 4, if not all of them, so that this is a discussion that happens on a as regular as we meet basis. So because it feels like we are moving forward. It's 2 meetings. We want to continue to do that and get the momentum. And Matt's right. They challenge us. When we're having the meetings discussing risks, it's a challenge to us, and that's helpful. And then we come here and we have the challenge from a political perspective as well as that challenge from RSM with their expertise. So it certainly feels like we're in a better place than we were in July, and I'd like to see that continue here.
Thank you. Yeah, well, from a governance point of view, from our peer review, risk management was considered to be an issue. So obviously we've taken that on board and put this in place to address some of that, and not just to tick the box to say we're doing it, but to actually deliver risk management that the organisation needs and actually act on it, which is what's driven a lot of the work with internal audit, bringing in RSM and CMAP to do that, because obviously internally we just had a single resource before, which was, wholly inadequate for what our needs were. So it has moved on considerably. Are there any other points anyone wants to make on that or comments? Looking around the room. You last word, Councillor Simpson?
Are you suggesting I talk to you?
No, I'm suggesting you've got quite a lot of experience on risk management. So
I think the director made a very reasonable point in the split between operational and strategic risk, and I think it is important to understand the difference between the two. But I do think I think personally I'd rather the boards did see the risks that are identified within their area of control, and comment on them and try to work through what that is. And I think the political groupings as well, because I think these really live if everyone is invested in it. The last thing any of us want, I think, is this just to be a dusty piece of paper or several bits of paper. So I think it would be good that each board is tasked to understand what their risks are. Yeah. But I absolutely get the point that a bunch of that is operational as well as the strategic risk.
And some of that might be to actually have a report to each board about what their current operational risks are that are being worked on. So there's a knowledge.
The points we made a couple of times about Power BI, and I absolutely agree. The reporting that has happened on financial performance, well, it hasn't. So there hasn't been any. So you haven't had it, and you've not seen it, but you will, because that's what we're building. Again, it's getting it to the right point, but from my perspective, risk comes with performance reporting. So you would get the key risks with the performance reporting on. Again, the regularity of your boards is slightly odd, but normally you do that on a quarterly basis, and as far as possible, we'll try and bring quarterly information to those boards. So there will be strategic risks here, and the board will see as part of the performance suite those operational risks.
If there are no other points on that one, I'm happy to move that from the chair. Do I have a second? Councillor Simpson, thank you. All in favour? Thank you, that's carried. And then we move on to, thank you for that one. And then we move on to agenda item 8, which is the exclusion of the press and public. So, to consider whether in accordance with section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972, that the public and press be excluded from a meeting for the following items of business on the grounds it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined by Schedule 12A of the Act. Propose that from the chair. Shall I have a second? Councillor Amelia, thank you. All in favour? Thank you.